As we gather here today, I've been asked just to say a few words of reflection. My name is Eric LeCompte. I'm a part of the global Jubilee movement that many of us are a part of. And a few things that I would like to offer and say as we get ready to hear from our panel of experts today. This issue of debt, of innovative economic aid, and changes to the financial system that can benefit all of us, not only are they actually critical, it's important to note that these particular issues have been prioritized by the South African government, everything from debt relief to international bankruptcy, as issues that they think are central to the G20 presidency. And I think a big part of the reason that we're gathered here and that we're working together preparing for the November summit is because not only do we raise the prophetic, we're also about the strategic. And it's important to engage the government on an issue that they have prioritized and an issue that the faith community has prioritized for 30 years. So I would invite us, as we hear our panelists today, to think of that reality, that we are all on pilgrimage together during Jubilee 2025, this historic and sacred moment. But to think as we're engaging that the G20 governments have adopted this priority. With that said, it's going to be up to us to be able to move them. I think the other piece, which is quite hopeful, is, amidst the varying views of the U.S. government, the U.S. government is picking up the presidency of the G20 next year. And the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, as well as the most influential member of Congress on these issues, the Republican head of Financial Services, French Hill, have also adopted these issues as critical issues. Debt relief, reform of the international financial architecture, as well as looking at innovative forms of aid that don't cost taxpayers in the North any money. So for better or worse, I think that's the framing that we're going into this moment with, that what our panelists are discussing today are not only priorities of the South African presidency, we already know that they are priorities of the coming U.S. presidency as well. With that, let me turn it over to our moderator, Ndidi.
Thank you so much, Eric, and it's really an honor and privilege to be here with all of you. It's been a very long day, and the fact that you're here discussing such a critical issue gives us a lot of joy. We could have picked any panel, and what we want to do today is to spend 20 minutes engaging with experts on the platform or in the front row, and then actually come to you to have a very robust discussion. And we want to leave here with some very practical next steps. Actually, the two young ladies, please identify yourselves, have a very nice sign-in sheet. And that sign-in sheet includes your name, your country, and do you want to get involved? Yes or no? I didn't come up with this sign-in sheet, the organizers did, but I think it's actually a great idea. Because the concept of the coalition of the willing and people of faith who share similar values actually is a very powerful force. And what Jubilee showed us 20 years ago is that when you have people who have common missions, common vision, values that are bigger than themselves, that we can actually take on huge, huge, intractable problems. And the problems we're currently discussing today actually stem out of the last panel. And I wanted to raise my hand at the last panel because I felt poverty and inequity are linked to finance, right? And the architecture that we have inherited today are really, it's time for them to be dismantled. And so I come to this from the One Campaign. I'm the CEO and president of the One Campaign, which is a global advocacy organization, which was part of Jubilee, and is part of Jubilee again. So Eric and his team have done fantastic work. And One fights for the equity and justice. And we believe at One that none of us are equal until all of us are equal, and that where you're born should not determine whether you live. And we fought for South Africa to actually host the G20, and for the African Union to have a seat. And prior to the G20 Summit, we started working on this idea of the cost of capital. And we took this on because Africa, as a continent, pays the most for debt. Debt itself is not a bad thing, but we pay 500% more than other regions of the world because of an unfair bias linked to negative stereotypes. We value this bias at close to $75 billion. And so that means that the average bond on Africa is 9.8%, right? Interest. Compare that to Germany, 3%. Latin America, 6%. Asia, including India, 8%. But Africa is paying 9.8%. For private equity and private investment, and the background I come from is the private sector, dollar-denominated expectations are double digits, 21%, 25%. Dollar-denominated return on investment for a private sector-related investment in agriculture, which is a sector that I've worked in. So this is a critical issue, and unless we dismantle these barriers and change narratives and provide data that shows an alternative, we will continue to face the poverty and inequity in our region. So this esteemed panel is going to be sharing some very practical recommendations. We don't want to talk about problems anymore. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about them. We want to talk about recommendations and what people of faith can do in their spheres of influence to make change happen. So I'm going to start off with my brothers, starting with you, sir. Just introduce yourself, what you're coming to this, the lens you're coming to this with, and what practical recommendations. Now, interestingly, I was just standing back, and we hosted a cost of capital event on Tuesday last week with Sim at your leadership center, and came up with some very practical ideas around innovative finance, data, dismantling some of the global problems, but I would like to hear from you and what people of faith must and should do at this time to take on this challenge. So over to you, sir.
And Ndidi and our co-panelists, I was just passed a secret note from the organizers that we actually have until 5:30 for this event.
Thanks everyone, and I'm honored to be here and humbled as well. Yeah, I find myself in an interesting position because as a banker, but within a faith-based event, I think it's a unique position that I'm in. But I represent the Shari'ah compliant financial services sector, broadly known as Islamic finance globally. I head up the Islamic finance division for Standard Bank, we're the largest bank on the continent. So I'm honored to be here and share some thoughts. Obviously, being a faith-based event, the assumption that I'm going to run is that we all hold some faith in some way or form. And my comments on some of the ideas of how we may look at restructuring the architecture that we've inherited is through that lens of faith. If you just broadly analyze the systems that we've inherited, most, if not all of the systems that we've inherited are man-made systems. And each of these man-made systems have rooted their systems in a particular value on analysis. If you take capitalism as an example, which is probably one of the most pervasive systems in the world today, you see that capitalism has rooted their value in the value of freedom. So you see this in the laissez-faire approach to markets, in how price derivation takes place in the marketplace, with what Adam Smith called the hidden hand. And in retrospect, what you see is, yes, this has given significant growth to economies through the world, but it has almost eradicated the value of equality. And then what some analysts or writers have deemed almost a knee-jerk reaction to capitalism, you had emerging scientific socialism or communism, where the value that was then anchored was equality. And if you do an analysis of that system, it probably almost eradicated the value of freedom. And so if you look at the architecture of the world today, you're vacillating between these two extremes. On the one hand, you've got a view that says, no, we need to have complete and absolute equality. And on the other extreme, you have a system that puts forward the idea that we need to have absolute freedom. But if we analyze all of the different faiths throughout the world, and if you look at the legacy of the teachings of each of the major traditions and faiths, you see that you can reconcile this dichotomy between absolute freedom and absolute equality by putting forward justice as the counterbalance. That you keep absolute freedom in check with justice. You keep absolute equality in check with justice. And with this, you potentially start to reach a practicable system of economy. And there was just 3 principles that I jotted down potentially that we can work towards. The first is to enable everyone in mankind to get what they rightfully deserve. Not just tacit capital flows, but what you actually work for. If you actually had a right over the factor of production in economic terms, then that person must get their due and deserve what they get. The second is obviously we need to work towards eradicating the concentration of wealth. It's like a blood clot, right? Blood in the system in your body needs to flow. If it clots in one place, it's detrimental. Similarly, wealth, we need to find ways of distributing that wealth. And then the third, which I conclude my opening remarks with, is all of our major religions and beliefs in the world hold the same belief. We operate within an environment where we perceive the wealth we generate as ours. But it's actually not ours. It's God Almighty's. And if we operate knowing that that wealth is not ours, but we are the custodians of that wealth, that idea of distributing and working with that wealth with justice and equity starts to become more prevalent in the systems as we know it potentially beginning to get dismantled. Thanks.
I think we need a third mic here. Thank you very much. Excellent points, but I'm going to just come back to you quickly because you've laid a very good framework. But remember we talked about spheres of influence. So you sit at a financial institution, that's a sphere of influence in Africa. And so people of faith are investors in your company, they're customers of your company, they can choose where they put their money, and you are also an influencer with the amount of money under your management. For the Shari'ah banking of Standard Bank, how much are we talking about? How many millions? And so how do you play a role in dismantling the systems to ensure that that equity and that justice becomes the norm? Just quickly, responsible.
Ndidi, one of the things that you mentioned, obviously, is the capital markets. And I think if you look at, you touched on something so important in terms of what pricing looks like within the capital markets today. Nearly every African sovereign has risk premiums baked into their bonds that are nearly, if you look at what interest rates are currently in the US versus what we're paying here in Africa, and South Africa are not excluded. We need in 2023, South Africa started into the Islamic finance debt capital markets, and the pricing of that went up to 12%, nearly if you look at the longer tenors. So I think one of the things that we're trying to work towards is how do you start accessing capital at a much cheaper rate? And one of the data points that we have in our world today is, and again, my comment is skewed towards the world of Islamic finance because that's where we're operating, is you're sitting on a ton of cash. The latest report suggests that there's nearly $300 billion of surplus cash sitting within the Islamic finance environment. That cash concentrated within GCC region, Southeast Asia. The sum total of pension funds, deposited money, sovereign wealth funds, etc. And what we're trying to work towards is, if you take that and equate it to what the medium-term fiscal deficits are of some of the bigger economies in Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, South Africa, you almost have a near perfect match in terms of nominal values between the medium-term fiscal deficits and surplus cash sitting within the Islamic finance environment. So what we're trying to work towards is how do you pair these two at better pricing? Because you need a home for this capital in a Sharia compliant asset, which is asset-based or asset-backed, that has ethics based into it, that has accountability baked into it, and all of the other things that some of our previous panels spoke about. So this is one big work stream that I personally am working towards, is matching those surplus units of liquidity and the deficit units, and hopefully trying to get our sovereigns on the continent better pricing.
I like that. We're giving you homework. Please pass the microphone to him. Like our earlier panel said, there's more than enough food. It's just being wasted. In this case, there's more than enough money, even in this continent. We've calculated about $3 trillion of money that's stuck in pension funds. $3 trillion of African good money, not illicit flows, stuck in investment capital in Geneva and in other parts of the world. So I'm just using this concept, and yet the poor pay so much for debt or can't even access it. That is a problem we have to fix. Over to you, my brother. What are your solutions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I do have a proposed solution, but maybe let me just preface it because it might be important to understand where I come from. 25 years ago, most of us, and I think Eric and the Honorable from the UK reminded us that we celebrate or we marked and campaigned around Jubilee 2000 as recalled by the Pope John Paul at the time. It just so happened that there was a chairperson of Jubilee South Africa and a member of Jubilee Africa, and we led campaigns in Ghana, Zimbabwe, Kenya, in Burkina Faso, Senegal. And I recall that we attended the G7 meeting in Cologne, Germany, where we were raising the issue of third world debt and the issues of impoverishment and underdevelopment of Africa. Our call then was simply two things. One was debt cancellation, in particular framing the debt of Africa as an odious debt, which means a debt that really did not benefit the people of Africa, but also we're calling for the reform of the global financial architecture, specifically the Bretton Woods institutions, on the basis that they were undemocratic and they were imposing structural adjustment programs on African countries. Now, I raise that because sometimes when you see it, it's as if you are, as if I'm reliving those 25 years ago. And I think it's important to say that even then, as activists, we're mindful of the moral dilemma of calling for debt forgiveness to the political elite that themselves in Africa were undemocratic. And we're beginning to continuously asking what Bishop Sipumas raised today to say, how do you call for debt relief to unaccountable leaders or to lead the same? They are going to lose the same money. So there was already a call for mechanisms of accountability within the debt relief, in particular the involvement of civil society in the process of that debt cancellation. That is just as something that just happened at the political elite level. Now, just to mention, to contextualize, at the time, the World Bank study was saying that the developing countries' debt stood at about $4 trillion. Today, it is at $31 trillion. Now, that just shows how the problem, and in fact, when it was 4 trillion, we thought it is a crisis. Now, you can imagine now it is nearly 3 times even more than that. So it is more than a crisis. So it is clear that unless something is done, this trajectory is not going to solve itself. And the sad part is, we now know that this is by design, it's not accidental. I mean, John Perkins in 2004 produced a book called The Confessions of the Economic Hitman, John Perkins was working for the World Bank, and it clearly states there how it is their work to go to countries and make them take the debt they don't need, so that they can be indebted and be controlled. So now the question is, what is to be done? Number one, firstly, therefore, I say that what the situation that of the debt is not an accident, is by design. It's a political decision. Therefore, you need a political decision at the G20 level. You know, I found myself saying, we need leadership like the Trump leadership. The leadership that when he speaks, it makes a difference. Doesn't matter. You see, Trump might be wrong, you might not agree with him on anything, but the fact of the matter is if he says there's going to be an end to this war, there are no ends. And that is what we need. The G20 must have a certain political peak. So the first thing is a paradigm shift in the architecture. That's the point number one. Paradigm shift from a focus on political and economic relations into values. And this is what the G20 South Africa is trying to do. To reintroduce values of solidarity, equality, sustainability into the entire discourse of political decision making. Number two, a reset of the global financial system. Reset. Now, reset simply means it must go back to its original purpose. When it was designed post-Second World War II, it was to reconstruct the global economy and end poverty. And it deviated. It must just go back to its original purpose. Number three, it must now refocus on the issue of inequality in global among nations and poverty eradication. The decision can be made. We will only fund and give debt in those programs that promote this. And finally, it must be driven also by the need for environmental sustainability and addressing, as a matter of emergency, vulnerable communities due to climate challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Cecilia, for your passion, for sticking with this for over 20 years. That takes a lot of stamina and courage. And thank you for calling out what needs to frame our discussion. I just want to underscore one point you raised, which is, yes, we need accountability frameworks in restructuring our debt, but we also need accountability frameworks in taking on new debt. Because we are seeing in many countries that new debt is still being taken on without civil society engagement, and faith communities have to be part of that. I want to add that. And one last thing you mentioned, which I think is really important, is the courage and boldness, right, that the South African government and other governments need to take at this time. So thank you so much. And then last but not least, my brother, please just introduce yourself and your action points.
Thank you so much. My name is Rambewane Swago, but since my name is just so complicated for many people, I think we can opt for Rambe. So I'm a Jesuit priest. I work in the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network in Africa and Madagascar. Just maybe as a way of introduction, I think the global finance plays a central role in shaping conditions of human well-being, access to opportunity and resilience in the face of crisis. And yet, the current architecture of finance, characterized by unequal access, debt dependency, financial exclusion, and the way asymmetrical power relations that we see, often undermines these goals. Against the spectrum of this Jubilee year 2025, against the principles of Ubuntu, which provide timely, ethical, and social frameworks for reimagining our equitable global financial system. So what I try here is to try to explore equity, human dignity, and relational solidarity, especially as articulated in the Catholic social teaching, which is my background, what informs my engagement in such matters of social justice and environmental justice, as it were. So this informs my intervention here. So when you look at the moral vision of Jubilee 2025, the Jubilee tradition, which is rooted in the biblical context of the biblical vision of Leviticus 25, it's a call for a systematic renewal. So renewal, and we're looking at forgiveness of debt. We're looking at the restoration of the liberation of the oppressed, and the healing of creation. So Jubilee 2025, as envisioned by Pope Francis and the social teaching of our church, is an invitation to rekindle a spirituality and a social ethic of integral justice. A justice that places the human person, especially the poor, those who live in the existential periphery of our societies, at the center of the concern. So maybe the key ethical foundations that we look at or we can consider is human dignity as the cornerstone of social and financial system, relational solidarity across borders, across generations, and across social classes, inclusion as a measure of justice, and leaving no one behind, particularly those who are in the margins, in the existential periphery of society. Forgiveness and restructuring of unjust debt as a practical expression of mercy and justice. So, in the context of the financial Jubilee, on the concept of financial, on the finance, Jubilee calls for the recognition or renegotiation of financial systems that entrench inequality and limit sovereignty and dignity of low-income nations and communities. Equity in financial architecture. So I think we also need to look at the difference between equity and equality. So equity recognizes the difference or the different starting points. And we have so many different starting points. The historical injustices, and the system barriers faced by various groups and many communities. So a just financial architect must therefore correct the structural imbalances rather than assume neutrality. So the core principles of when we look at finance equity, it's representation to ensure that the marginalized voices, including displaced persons, especially now we talk of climate displacement, but forcibly displaced persons in general, women and the global south nations are part of the financial governance bodies, the IMF, the World Bank. Their voice is heard, their voice is included in the discussions, in trying to find solutions. Redistribution, to promote just taxation, cancel unsustainable debts, and support fair trade and climate financing mechanisms. Access, expand inclusive financial services, credit, insurance, and digital identity, including for refugees and migrants, those who have run away from violation of human rights and they find themselves in other countries. And the issue of documentation when we talk of migrants and refugees, which denies them access, and the former workers as well. That's a continuation of violation of their human rights. Accountability, we've spoken a lot about accountability, we heard about accountability this morning as well. Holding financial institutions accountable as well for social and environmental impacts is also important. So financial justice also demands a reassessment of systems that profit from crisis. I mean, we have those who make a killing out of a crisis situation, including speculative markets, exploitative remittance fees, and extractive investment practices. Now, when we look at the concept of Ubuntu, the ethics and relational economics, so in our context of Ubuntu, I am because we are. It emphasizes interdependence, mutual care for one another, and the well-being of the community over an individual or individual gain. So this relational worldview offers a powerful counter-narrative to this individualistic, competitive ethos that dominates the global finance. Ubuntu, when we apply it to finance, we see in economy as a tool for collective flourishing, not just for private accumulation. We can look at maybe things like community-based finance, where cooperative savings, mutual aid and institutions, and the earth. Advocacy for ecological integrity and protection of the vulnerable ecosystems and communities. So Ubuntu invites us to form a finance that does not abandon the most vulnerable, including the forcibly displaced, the migrants, and all those people who have suffered so many injustices, and the economically excluded systematically. It upholds sacredness of every human life and a moral obligation to create a system of shared responsibility, as it were. I would like to touch on the issue of migration.
So we want to give a little time for the audience.
Okay, let me just, my last point on the Jubilee inspired financial reform. So build a new financial architecture inspired by the Jubilee ethics, by Ubuntu and equality. And that requires a level of commitment to debt cancellation. We've spoken about that. And we also need to be, when we talk of debt cancellation, the issue of corruption should also be accompanied with that advocacy. That we make sure that when there's a debt cancellation, the money that is saved, it goes where it should. We see daily the damage caused by corruption. Public funds meant for schools, clinics are stolen. We should be vigilant against. Creation of a financial international system, which, like things like for loss and damage compensation, refugee support and climate adaptation, inclusive digital finance initiatives, and reform in the international institution. So faith and civil society leadership, churches and faith institutions must amplify the call for financial justice, rooted in scripture, in spirituality, in moral witness. I think I would do the job.
Thank you so much. I like that you've laid out very, very robust principles. And now we're going to go to the audience, but I just want to frame some provocative questions for you, because we really want to leave here with a coalition of the willing that's signing up for something. So we've heard very loudly that there is funding available. It has to be allocated to the poorest of the poor at the best and most affordable rates. There are principles that underpin debt restructuring, but these principles have to be rooted in accountability and transparency. I'm going to ask the audience, as people of faith and your sphere of influence, if you're prioritizing what debt should be for, debt restructuring for school feeding, for healthcare worker salaries. Some of you have heard about debt restructuring for teacher salaries, not debt forgiveness in total. How would we prioritize as people of faith where this debt restructuring should be allocated? That's one. As people of faith, what can you do with your pulpit or your sphere of influence around illicit financial flows? Can you actually tell some people in your congregation to walk out the door because they've stolen money, some politicians? Can you ask them to bring back the money? Can you reject some tithes and offerings from corrupt sources? Can you speak out in terms of the high rates that loan sharks are offering to the poor? I want us to leave with some even the values, right, that underpin our work. Can we as faith communities commit to a set of values that will influence our ecosystem around equity and justice? Can we as a faith community take on regulatory and rating agencies, right, in terms of the guiding principles that we can agree on? What are we going to leave here with? I'm throwing out ideas. Some of them might seem too radical. Some of them are not radical enough. what can we leave here with that we can say we're willing to work on further to push this agenda, so that 20 years later I'm not coming here with my brothers with a little more gray hair talking about the same issue. So I will take 3 or 4 comments at once. Please introduce yourself, keep your comments short, and then we'll come back. Eric will close us out with the final set. So I'm going to cut you off if you talk for more than 1 minute. I'm a Nigerian entrepreneur. So just remember, introduce yourself, make your comments so we can get a few. Okay? Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Who's speaking is His Royal Majesty King Bongwe of the Ndidi Nation in South Africa, the Emperor of the Ndidi. Also, I'm the President of the International Association of World Peace Advocate, COSOC United Nations. I'm the President for Peace in 54 countries in Africa. But here is the time, so if you read that this 2025 as a Jubilee year, a principle of equity in the architecture of finance. Architecture, that means you build, you design, you plan. One, we need to have a plan of action to preach in one thing that it doesn't bring solutions. This structure in finance, architecture of finance, everybody, either you may do business, is there. That is the structure that it will make you to shape up your business. Now, if you look it back, and then this needs to be structured. Number one, these service level agreements, they are not in favor of the humankind. Where is the spirit of Ubuntu? For example, practical. If you're taking a home loan, I know I will take more of a one minute time.
You know, Your Royal Highness, I respect authority, but you have to keep it short.
We're not going to build Africa if you are going to say now to your father, this is so much. Please let me speak, and it will build us. So unfortunately, I'm sorry. But now, these structures, it is in one favor. You cannot say you are expressing somebody, then you say you're giving a loan, for example, a home loan of 5 million. Now he has to pay 14 million. So that's a struggle of Africa. It's a rip-off of this rate, and then it needs to be structured. Number two, you know, if we look at all the debts of these countries that are there is these people that are benefiting in making money. Why don't we say, we've got African Union, you've got European Union. Go in your home, structure yourself, so that you can, these service level agreements, it can be shaped up. Like in South Africa, like in Africa, we are only the consumer. Although we are the producers in terms of any minerals, any coal. But this level service agreement, I don't know how they are structured. And within this very same structure of finance, it's killing us. So that one, we need to take an initiative. And then says, where do we get money? For example, if it takes a man to be a man, not a child to be a man, and says, as the citizen in different countries, to get out of these loans that we say it must be cut off, of which we don't know how do we find ourselves within. So now if we say we are paying maybe $1 per head, just for example, if here in South Africa, 1,000, maybe we are 65 million, the population. 65 million people, we're making 65 billion. The revenue that we are going to take ourselves out from this debt and we become independent. So because of time, so I wanted to say more, but that is the situation. We need to take an initiative that we must take ourselves out. You cannot say you are taking a loan to be out of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very, very important comments and a sense of urgency. Please, over to the lady. But please keep it short, please, so we can get as many voices in. Go ahead.
Thank you. I acknowledge that we are talking to each other. And this is new to me as a South African. So my request is that I would like to request that we come with an accountability framework in this room, because I've never worked for South African government and I'm a South African. For the past 27 years, I've employed 250 staff through the American money. So I came here not to have a conversation from having the UN that funded me to come here. For the past 7 months, I've been sitting at home because of the restructuring from Mr. Donald Trump. So we are here to really, we are seeking for a true accountability, not to enjoy these wars. So I would like to request for a true accountability framework, and I would like to participate on that. I am the UN convener for the traditional leaders and religious leaders in South Africa. So when it comes to paradigm shift, I'm requesting for an advocacy and policy engagement, because what is written here, I don't know the strategy or the policy or the document. I don't know what are you talking, what inform your, where are you basing your framework? So I think as we need to account to each other and not have, we left, some of us are single mothers. I lead global mothers in leadership, women who started climate change in villages. They don't have access to land. So, and even our traditional leaders, they own land. I'm wrapping up, I acknowledge that. They own land, and land for us is wealth. But that wealth, the tree farms, are owned by the few elites who've been engineering apartheid. I'm not a racist, I've been educated by white elites in the world. So we do have money. So we need to take this, we are now in September, and this 2025 Jubilee is ending, and we're talking about 2080, talking, flying conferences. Yeah? So I'm requesting that we localize Jubilee, because when we're talking about the South African government that has bought into this, I haven't seen the localization. I don't have a document. So I'm requesting to participate in coming with the strategy. And finally, I like the first speaker, the banker. What a sensible man. He talks about philosophies and worldviews, the theories. You go to South African black universities, they are shaped by Marxists who was born in 1800. And you are telling us that those are the leaders who are going to shape our country with the Marxist thinking, socialism. And you find that good education, they don't learn that. So we need to do the architecture in the university. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my traditional rule has spoken, Mama has spoken, everybody else has to keep it short, because they haven't given us more time. So please, 1 minute each. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rabbi Dr. Aaron Rafi. I'm the Managing Director of the Orthodox Interfaith Center based in Israel. Also an economist, published on the Jewish thought and teach that. The ideas of Jubilee and Shari'ah, that would have come from the Hebrew Bible, so I have not to say about that. But the main thing I want to say, the problem we have is the problem of trust. That's a question to you, because to attract investors, they need trust, and they need to have trust in two things. One, that the money they give will be used for the right purpose, and that's a problem of corruption. B, that the money will be paid back at a certain point. So if you do that relief, it has to be coupled with a change that next time people will be willing to invest because they know it's going to be used for a good cause and paid back. And the way to do it in my last 10 seconds, to your question, we need to invest in human capital, social capital. We also need infrastructure and all that, but the emphasis should be on that, because the structure of society and culture, that's the key to trust, both internal and external. I would trust a society that has this human and social capital. I would not trust a society that doesn't have that. Therefore, as an investor, I want to see that. So, human and social capital, that would be the main investment.
Thank you. Thank you for being very efficient. Yes. And then we'll come to you, sir.
Thank you. Dels Bazira from Georgetown. I direct the Global Health Institute of Georgetown. I'm also a professor. Mohammed, you mentioned the availability of money in one part of the world and then the scarcity of money in another part of the world. Last year, direct foreign investment into Africa was $97 billion. Diaspora remittances was $100 billion. But in all this conversation, and this diaspora money, I'm one of those that sends money back to Uganda, it comes in individual remittances. It's never aggregated. Is there a way we could tap into those new financing sources where countries could actually have a better interest rate for borrowing because we have a stake in our countries, in our continent? Instead, we spend more time talking about how we're going to reform the global architecture that largely we don't have a lot of power to reform because also it has got vested interests that will protect it. Why not also think out of the box and see how we can mobilize new financing sources, and that will in the end create competition that weakens the global finance architecture that's not equitable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then the last question from the gentleman.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Nwuneli, and I work with the Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa and also regional facilities out there in major groups and stakeholders in Africa. I will go straight to your questions and the very provocative questions that you put across. One, I think that faith, Ubuntu are personal. And they have to be personalized at my very personal level. I think in the declaration that we have signed, there should have been a question of, number one, if you're asking for forgiveness of debt, am I willing to forgive my debtors? And how much of that? Because there's no way I'm going to be praying or asking an addict to stop taking alcohol or drugs, and I'm doing the same. So it's got to be personalized. And this also goes to our faith communities. If, for example, my Catholic church, it owns banks, how much of debt are we willing to forgive the poor who have, for example, are unable to pay? Because all the religious texts demonstrate that putting a yoke on another human being in the name of debt is not right. We've got to introduce colonialism and historical injustices into this conversation, because the systems and architecture we have of finance have come from a place of injustice and direct dominance over the human being. There is no way we are going to address an issue of architecture or finance without looking at the origins of the same. It is informed and founded on looting, slavery, rape, death, and all those bad atrocities. We've got to talk about that. We've got to undo those injustices. Lastly, while I want to own everything that my ancestors have passed on to me, I refuse to own the outcomes of the injustices that have been inflicted upon me just because I was born with a black grandfather. We've got to look at how my grandfather got into this debt in the first place. If I give a very simple example, in my country, before the colonialists came, our people had about 1,800 heads of goats and cattle. And they were required at one point in the introduction of hut tax and livestock tax to reduce that to 5. Now you're telling me to get from 1,800 to 5, how do I do that? They were forced to give it away, sometimes to keep, allowing us to eat it. And that was the beginning of structured debt and poverty. This has got to be addressed from the beginning.
Thank you. That's a powerful way and a powerful statement to end. I'll pass it on to Eric, but I think it would be useful to have a few responses from the panel. I know that time is far spent, but I think they'll give us 10 more minutes. Just 2 minutes. 1 minute.
Thanks. I wanted to address 2 parts. The Jubilee year and the call for debt relief and to wipe off debt. The big question that we need to ask ourselves, and I think 2 of our audience members touched on it, is how much are we willing to forgive? Because if you go to a bank today and say to the bank, wipe out all of the debt, the loans that you have, that means we lose all of our deposits at that bank. So how much of our money are we willing to lose? So I think that's the first, and the same goes to pension funds, etc. How much of our pension fund are we willing to write off? So I think in the call for debt relief, we must attempt to get to that point in a practicable manner. And it's going to need two sides to that point, because we as the investor or the depositor will have to take some pain if we want to execute that. The second is to answer my brother that asked a question around accessing finance. I think we've proven that in Nigeria and South Africa. South Africa raised the cheapest dollar funding ever when they issued a sukuk out, and much of Nigeria's road infrastructure has actually been funded through these modes of finance. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see come through very clearly from the investor is now what we're calling use of funds. So if you look at all of the prospectuses that are coming out, they're actually having a clause in there to say what is the use of funds, and if you cannot demonstrate use of funds, we're not giving you the money. So it's no longer a thing of it's going into the revenue account of the country. So we're starting to see that through, and that's us. That's the investor now coming through and saying, no, we want to demand use of funds. So my summary is, yes, use of funds, cheaper funding, case studies are there. Writing off of debts, I think we need a practicable solution, because it means all of us globally are going to take pain.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I think that the call to begin to think out of the box, because we can't, I'm personally tired, because I was the chair of Jubilee South Africa, 2000, went all over the world, and I sit here and repeat exactly the same thing. And I'm sure 25 years later, it's going to be the same thing. But the colleague who said, let's begin to think out of the box. And I can only say this, unless there is a political decision, people to repurpose this institution. Don't even eliminate them, just give them a new mandate so that they can begin to do good. This is what we need to say. And one of the good they must do is to eliminate inequality and create equality. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just two things I'll respond to, and then I'll pass it on to final speaker and then Eric Cruz. For the diaspora, and I think he's left the room, the doctor. We have actually created a diaspora health fund and a diaspora health insurance fund. I believe the diaspora have to be part of the solution, and that's key. I like the call to action on the personal commitment, but I also think the communities of faith, we need to come up with guiding principles for what equitable finance means for their community of faith and for our collective, and that has to be something we agree on, hopefully coming out of this. And then Mama, I think we will circulate the vision to everybody who's put in their email address, data to back it up, and some action steps for you to take. So I think that is something I will commit to, and I will work with Eric, because we have a lot of good information for you, and as many of you who want to take this on. And trust is critical, but I want to tell you that I've talked about narrative change about Africa. We have data from the IFC, 3 decades of investment, returns 6x S&P 500. You will never hear those stories about investing in Africa. The returns and the default rates are lower than most regions, and yet we overpay for that 500%. So there's a need for us to also elevate the success stories and elevate the success stories, the positive stories, and change narratives so we can demand fairer financing for our continent.
Thank you. I think quickly, equality. I think we need to realize that some of the injustices that happened in the past, many people were denied opportunities. So when we talk of equality, we shouldn't talk or be thinking of equality of outcomes, but also equality of opportunities. As a South African, I have been denied, and many of us who look like me, we have been denied opportunities. So you can't expect us to produce same products or same whatever outcomes should be the same as those who were given more opportunities than us. So that's the first thing. So we must focus on equality of opportunities as opposed to equality of outcomes. And secondly, we need to look at governance and capacity building. We need to make sure that people are held accountable. And the issue of corruption, we should not take it lightly. When we talk of debt cancellation, we really need to make sure that the money goes where it should go, to the vulnerable, to the hospitals, clinics, and where it is needed or where it should go. So that vigilance, it cannot be overemphasized. So equality of opportunities, looking at vigilance over corruption, and making sure that people get those who deserve this money, they get it. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me take a moment to wrap up. First, I would like us to thank Ndidi for the amazing job that she did moderating a possible class. Second, I want to thank all of you in the room. And our organizers that have brought us together have done such an incredible job. And I think we also need to share with our organizers that we all want more time to speak and engage. And I think if we had had more time, we had that. But this issue and the other issues that we've come together on, we all have a voice. And we need to create some space over the remaining 3 days so that we can all lift the voice of the important things that we raise. And I'd like to finally thank our amazing panelists, if we can. In closing, this does not do justice to our panelists. I'm going to lift one point that each of our panelists raised, which I believe was a demand and calling for us. First, Mohammed, Ameen, thank you for your remarks. And I would say one powerful thing we take away from Islamic finance, as well as many of our religious teachings, is that lending must lift, not exploit. Lending must lift, not exploit. And thank you for that message. And then to thank one of our global founders, Nwuneli, for his comments. And again, I won't do justice, but I think what you continued to share with us was that we must have the powers that be able to demand what we want. And I think that's absolutely critical, and I'm going to take it a little bit further and to say no matter where we sit and who we are, we all have power. Even though the G20 will make many of these decisions, we actually all have influence over the G20, whether or not we live in a G20 country. And let me say just a moment about that. Many people now are calling the G20 the G21. And the reason they are doing that is because now for 2 years, the African Union has become a full member of the G20. Not only the African Union, but all of the development banks caucus with the G20, the UN, and the IMF. So even if we think we are in a place where our country may not be one of the countries that sits on the G20, we all have power with our governments as we launch these 5 years of campaigns in 160 countries for change. And just as we're lifting our voices here, we must lift our voice to the places of power, because we are the real power. And the last piece I would reflect on is what Rampe had offered us, reflecting on our traditions in terms of the transformation that must take in the financial system, the financial architecture, for new ways of being, which are all possible in the next 5 years, such as a new international bankruptcy process. But not only did our brother lift religious teaching, I think very specifically the idea of Ubuntu is actually core to what the Jubilee promise and the Jubilee ethos is. When we say, I am because we are, even though we exist because of a kind and loving and merciful God, it would be wrong for us to think that God simply calls us or God is simply in existence to forgive our debts. It's actually a promise, an agreement, a reciprocal promise. God forgives our debts. God forgives our sins as we forgive the debts and sins of others. Ubuntu. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I want to also ask you to do a round of applause my big brother here, Dr. Sarele, have been fighting for many, many years and have not given up. And I want to end with a quote from a young African who said, and some of you might know the prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And he said, no, I'm going to change it. I'm going to ask God and the Almighty to give me the courage and wisdom to change the things I cannot accept. And I cannot accept that the global financial infrastructure or the African financial infrastructure will continue to remain unjust. I cannot accept that the poor pay more for debt. I cannot accept that we're going to come back here 20 years later and have the same discussion. So may God grant us the wisdom and courage to change the things we cannot accept. Amen.
Okay, I think it's done, right? Yeah, let's stop recording.
Okay.